Kyall, lovely to see you. Welcome to the Fall Forward podcast. It's wonderful to have you here right at the start of 2025. How are you, my friend?
I'm great. How are you, man? Very, very busy. Busy start to the year, but it's fantastic to be here. Thank you.
I think it has been a busy start to the year, and I think for lots of different reasons, both probably macro reasons and micro reasons. But it's great to have you here at the start of the year. And before we kind of delve into all the different themes and topics of today's conversation, I'd love perhaps for those who haven't met you yet, Carl, across the membership and more broadly, just give us an overview of who you are and kind of and then we'll kind of jump straight in if that's okay with you.
Yeah, not a problem at all. So I am a Vietnamese boat refugee, which means after the Vietnam War, my family fled the country and I ended up in Australia. Um, so I am an Australian citizen. I then spent 10 years in London as well, and I'm now living here in New York City for the last 8 years or so. In terms of what I do for work, I'm a chief innovation officer at Esquire Bank, and I largely focus on CRM, digital marketing, any revenue generating platforms. And I also run the marketing function as well. So it's been about 4 years at the executive level at this bank. We are a publicly listed bank on the stock exchange and a very high top performing bank as well. But that's me in a nutshell.
So, Carl, we've known each other for a little while now, and I always love our exchanges. And seeing you over the probably the year or so that we've known each other now, super nice guy, super bright guy, award-winning guy. Um, Business is smashing it. Your functions are doing super well, and as you can see behind you, are winning awards. Theory, I suppose the topic of conversation for us today is failure. I mean, that doesn't sound like failure at all, Carl, in my world. But so I'm really interested to know, what for you stands out in terms of failures and lessons that have driven you, because you don't become successful without failing. So I'd love to perhaps start with a little bit perhaps around your origin to drive and to succeed in the way that you do.
Sure. Failures. Where do I start? There's been so many. Even though, you got the trophies in the cabinet behind, you're absolutely right. You don't move forward unless you fall down and get the hell back up. And it's really all about how quickly you get up and how you do that. Um, you know, the thing that immediately comes to mind is I built my career being really good at CRM, Salesforce implementations, and I've been on many Salesforce implementations throughout my career. I've been doing Salesforce marketing, CRM type, and marketing automation implementations for about 18 years. And not all of them went smoothly. Actually, a lot of them didn't go very well. I've seen and been part of many different large projects that haven't gone too well at all. And part of that, political issues, project issues, maybe issues within myself and what I could have done better. A huge range of what you might call failures. But the best thing about some of the failures is after you get those knocks and bruises and you get back up, you realize you're a lot stronger for it. And you realize that you're learning from your mistakes. I've literally done about 8 different Salesforce migrations and implementations across Fortune 500 organizations. And really, it wasn't until about the fourth or the fifth where things kind of really kind of like humming along really well. But I did learn a hell of a lot from those failures.
You talk there, Carl, about mindset. Really, that you've
Mm.
kind of shifted your mindset from one of "holy crap, I've just failed" to "okay, that's a step in learning. That's part of my journey to learning." There's two elements to that. I think talking to members, talking to leaders. One is one about you and your mindset, and the other is a cultural mindset. So we'll put cultural mindset to the side for 1 minute. I'm interested in you to start with. What what drives you as a leader, Carl, to be able to not just sustain yourself, but to be able to move through failure, but more importantly than that, also aspire and drive yourself to become a high performer? And that those things are very closely linked. What drives you?
You know, as I've gotten older and done quite a lot of inner work, I'm in my mid 40s now. The answer to that question would have been very different earlier on in life and before I kind of started doing a lot of this inner work. And now, where I'd like to approach that is where the fire that burns inside of me, where did that come from? And what that fire basically did earlier on in my career that contributed to failure was, as I mentioned earlier on, I am a Vietnamese boat refugee, and there's lots of different things that come with that. My parents, the Vietnam War, a lot of the traumas that maybe they experienced in their life, and whatever got passed down to me. I'm a firm believer that in order to understand yourself, you need to understand your parents and your parents' parents and the lives that they led. And to be honest, that furnace that burns inside of me to achieve and do things and, run forward at a million miles an hour, that is fantastic for achieving things. It's fantastic for progress. It's fantastic for getting projects done, but sometimes that furnace burns too bright. Sometimes that burning furnace might affect other people. Sometimes it might affect you and your life and how you approach things. And it's often great to have that furnace because it drives you to achieve and do things. But understanding when you actually maybe need to dial that furnace down in certain scenarios or certain situations, it might be beneficial to have that furnace burn not so brightly if you're trying to build relationships and connect with people emotionally. But you might want to dial that furnace up when you're 2 weeks away from going live with a massive implementation. You've got 2,000 users that are going to be switching on with your system. And that was very much a key learning for me as I got older, as I turned from someone who's really good at doing one thing and then manage a team doing that thing, and then managing multiple projects and multiple team members and project managers doing that thing, and just learning how to slightly dial that up and down, because I didn't dial it up and down, to be honest, when I was younger. And that kind of contributed very much to what I might call failures. The reality is, a lot of these implementations got done. A lot of these implementations achieved the goal. But I guess part of the learning with technology implementations is you're also winning hearts and minds, and sometimes if you're running ahead and forward and pushing forward like a consultant that has a deliverable, that furnace that burns inside, you tend to forget that you're trying to convince people to do things differently. You're trying to win them over as opposed to just implementing the best system you possibly can.
What made you become aware of that furnace, Carl? Because you and having speaking to you now for a while, you're an incredibly self-conscious person in terms of knowing yourself or building this self-awareness. But something must have made you want to go and really get to know yourself and your heritage and your person to be able to make a change. What was it that initiated that?
The catalyst was actually the pandemic. I was
Okay.
in New York City doing really well in my career, fancy apartment, lots of friends, raging kind of New York City, awesome social lifestyle, everything you could want, with you're in your 40s and in New York City. And the moment everything went dark with the pandemic, in that silence, I didn't love what was there. I didn't love what was going through my mind, and the fact that you realize maybe the connections and friendships that you think that you had aren't that strong. You know, when you pare back what you typically get in a New York City type environment, which is distraction, validation, and you're just left with your laptop at home on your own, trying to achieve that next thing, you realize that the coal that you're putting into that furnace starts to dissipate, and that furnace has been fed with very shallow things, you know. And it's at that point in time that I started asking the question, what else is there? I feel like I've achieved everything I could have. I've ticked all the boxes. I've traveled the world. I've lived in London. I've lived in New York City. I've worked for Fortune 500 organizations. I've done everything that society says I should be doing. I should be happy. What's going on? So that really started my journey with a couple of things that made a really big difference. I started to see a therapist. I went to executive training just to get a different perspective. And what I learned there was that the things that made me successful and where I got to today are definitely not the same things that I need to get me to where I need to be tomorrow from a life experience, life happiness, career perspective, and to just be a bit more of a complete human being, not just focusing on do this, do that, do that,
Yeah, no,
So that was really the catalyst.
and it makes like total sense, Carl. And I feel lots of people listening to this and members will really resonate with that because I think myself included, you went from this big open world to this box that you were in, and and that highlights the loneliness, and it also highlights the fact you have to be with your own thoughts a lot more than perhaps people had been. You touched on a couple of things. One of them was the word happiness, which I often feel like in the world that we're in, the executive leadership world of the largest businesses on the planet, the word happiness often doesn't come up enough, perhaps, in the conversations that we have. And actually, I'd be interested to know, in those successful early periods of your career, is it the realization that that didn't necessarily make you happy that was a part of that big driver? And then as a follow-up, what are you doing now, or what have you learned through that process that perhaps people can use to be like, well, actually, I'm ensuring that I'm using my furnace to achieve, but also most importantly, be happy in what I'm doing. I think that's such an important area and something I think that you can clearly speak to.
Yeah, I mean, those were questions that were asked for a long period of time, actually, because what is happiness? How do you rewire your brain when you grew up in poverty and difficult circumstances, with my background, and you're taught by your parents that happiness means money, security, achieving things, doing things. You go, okay, that makes sense. And you watch television, and television and society teaches you what happiness really is. And then you just go, you know. So for a very long time, the first question to ask is, what does happiness actually look like? How do you rewire your brain so that you're reparenting yourself from all of the things that not only are passed down into you through your generational kind of like thoughts, traumas, and all that kind of stuff, but also what does happiness mean actually for you? And I realized that I needed to rewire my hunt for validation. And this actually came from my childhood, and probably a lot of other people's childhoods as well, because if you grow up with parents and your parents aren't around, or you've got lots of siblings and you're struggling to get their attention, what you're often taught as a child is, okay, I need to do something really big to get their attention, and their validation is everything that life is all about, right? You just want to make mum and dad happy, get the best grades, get better grades than your brother and your sister and all that stuff. And that somehow wired, at least in my brain, this thing that happiness equates to validation. So therefore, I need to get more validation. So what do I need to get? More validation, more validation, more validation. But then the point with that is that it's very shallow. You're always hunting for the next thing. And that furnace that burns inside of you is just wants more and more of that coal, you know. And happiness, I've realized, is actually more about connection. It's not about what you're doing in New York City, how many parties you're going to, how many friends you've got, and all that kind of stuff. It's how many friends truly know who you are, and do you feel genuinely connected to? How many people in your life can you say that to? So having that perspective then also changes things from a work perspective as well, because when you start expanding your universe to understand that happiness is mostly about human connection, well, you spend 8 to 10 hours a day at work. It would really suck if all you're doing is trying to achieve the next thing and you're not really connecting with the people that you're working with, you know.
I wonder if there's any like practical things that you did to help you through that process, because it feels like it was a journey that you were on, and that kind of realization was happening. Are there things that you like, actually, did in order to make that happen, or is it just something that over a period of time you're like, I know what I need to do here to change my trajectory or change the role happiness plays in my success?
The funny thing is, when I mentioned to you that I go to therapy, there was something that tweaked inside of me. I was like, "Oh, should I be saying that?" Oh, I'm going to be on this podcast. It's quite vulnerable. I'm telling people, and culturally, so I'm Australian and I'm British and I live in New York City, and it's funny what people think about the word therapy in different nationalities and countries and cultures. When I tell my Australian friends that I'm going to therapy, they think I'm batshit crazy and there's something wrong and I'm going to be sent to a loony bin. Are you okay, Kyall? You're right. Kind of the similar-ish in London, but in New York City, everyone's got to therapy. If you're not going to therapy, something's wrong with you and you don't have that self-awareness. It's almost like a badge of honor. And the reason why I bring that up is the answer came after a long period of time of continually asking the question in sessions with your therapist, continually leaning into, what do I think about happiness? Well, I'm going to try something and slightly amend the way I approach certain people or scenarios. I'm going to be a bit more vulnerable in this particular instance. Let's see what happens. Go back, have the conversation, and then slightly tweak other things. And the point here is, it wasn't a case of you go up a mountain, meditate for 5 days, you come back and you got all the answers that you need. You know what I mean? You're literally just slowly sanding down edges in behavior or thoughts or the things that you always used to do that you need to slightly do differently. And over a long period of time, it's like your essence and your being slowly gravitates towards that. And that's what really long lasting true change is. It isn't about going on a weekend away with a Tony Robbins kind of concert and going, oh, I'm all changed. Actually, it's the work you do on a consistent and regular basis. It's the journaling, it's the meditation, it's the introspection that you have when you have a triggered scenario with, a friend, a workmate, or a family member. And then it's the 3 other times you do after that, and you realize, oh, okay, maybe it was me, as opposed to triggered situation, all their fault, I'm done. you know. So it really happens over a long period of time. And I like to think about therapy in a similar fashion to personal training. You know, I also do quite a lot of personal training. And the reality is, you're not growing unless your muscles are sore. And you need to get your muscles sore on a consistent and regular basis in order to build bigger muscles. Well, unless you're sitting down and talking to someone and they're giving you a different perspective and a professional perspective on the way you think, the way you behave, it's highly unlikely that you're going to do any long lasting change, particularly in instances, maybe when you have grown up in suboptimal circumstances, when that furnace that burns inside of you is super strong. And to be honest, that's a majority of executives. You know, a majority of executives have some sort of difficult story, overcome challenges, and now smashing it from a career perspective. You know, life perspective,
Maybe not
not
so.
sure.
Yeah, that really resonates because I think what's nice there, Carl, is that you're talking about the pain you feel in your muscles allowing you to grow, both from a learning through failure perspective, but also learning to be happy perspective. Those lessons are quite aligned, aren't they, in terms of being aware of that feeling of uncomfortableness. And I think you mentioned it almost at the beginning, but this idea that what got you here as a leader won't get you there. We hear that from members all the time in terms of, I need to access different thinking, I need to access different ideas, but that's the same in terms of, I maybe need to change the way I think about things in my own personal happiness. So I really enjoyed that perspective. Thinking about this idea of what got you here won't get you there. I suppose we highlighted there the personal side of getting through failure and developing a change in a happiness story or a driving force behind that. What about from a cultural perspective? Because being in Fortune 500 organizations historically was pretty challenging if you were the different person in the room. But now I know you're a big advocate for having different voices in the room. Talk to me about your view and your opinion on someone who's lived through that, and now your role in terms of building and creating teams that advocate for that diversity of thought and that kind of diversity of opinion.
Mm. Yeah, you know, being a Vietnamese, Australian, and British, by default, you're different. You know, I've never been in a room where there's anyone like me, you know. So that's kind of like the norm. I've never been in a room that someone with someone that thinks in the same way that I do. And to a large extent, I hope and I think that's kind of what people like. You know, when I've been in group scenarios or executive scenarios, they know I'm going to bring a very different approach and a very different perspective. But that's also very hard. You know, that is not, from my perspective, it sounds great on the outside. Okay, we've hired Kyall because he's innovative, he thinks differently, and he's going to bring some fresh ideas. And in my brain, you kind of think to yourself, oh, cool, I've made it to the executive group. They're going to have a nice ribbon ready to rock and roll. And when I get into the room, they're going to cut it and everyone's going to listen to you and it's going to be fantastic. And those, those are the fantastical ideas I have, romantic ideas I had in my head when I became an executive. But that wasn't the case at all, you know. Um, the reality is you're stepping into pre-existing relationships, long-standing relationships. In my instance, also being the youngest person in the room, you have to kind of navigate your own internal demons around imposter syndrome, you know. And I, in a very classic sense, approached executive leadership and taking my seat at the table in the same way that I had always approached other scenarios, which actually is great that you kind of bring up that you needing to be something different in order to transition. in a typical work scenario, and many executives as well, in your rise towards executive leadership, you are managing teams. You do end up being the top dog in the room. You call a meeting, everyone's there to listen to you. You know, you start speaking, people start getting quiet and go, okay, boss is talking, let's go, let's listen to him and all that kind of stuff. You're the alpha dog, basically. When you then walk into a executive scenario, you're not the alpha dog. You don't have those relationships. People aren't going to quietly, diligently listen to you. So then all of a sudden, approaching things in that old way where you're going to walk in, and which is what I did, walk in all buttoned up, beautiful presentations, validation, 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 is not the same approach that leads to success. At that level, it's all about building relationships, trust. You're actually not paid to deliver things. And this was a mindset shift I had to make, because previously I was paid to do awesome things, create awesome projects, software products and solutions. But actually, you're then paid to navigate the politics, lean on other people, learn how to lean on people, where to pull back, where to dial that furnace up, where to dial that furnace down. I'm going to put that category of soft skills, kind of put everything into the category of soft skills, but just navigating your way around those things are totally different to being what got you to where you are, which was an awesome individual contributor or manager of people,
Yeah.
So that was quite an interesting kind of transition as well.
We hear that story a lot around, I was amazing in my function. I built an incredible function. I'm now sitting around the table and I have no idea about what's happening around the rest of the boardroom table. And that feeling of imposter syndrome, or that feeling of, how do I not know everything that I needed to know? And of course, what none of us appreciate is that everyone in the room's feeling exactly the same thing, and yet none of us talk about it. How have you managed to, I suppose, use the fact that you've been bringing different ideas and different viewpoints while building that trust and relationship into the boardroom? How have you used that as a vehicle to bridge those gaps that you talk about there? What have you done? What are some of the things that have worked well for you?
I love the fact that you mentioned, and this is spot on, that you're in a room with executives and everyone's feeling the same thing, but no one's actually talking about it. And what that, if I were to translate that in real life, you've got people that are departmental functional owners, CFO, credit risk, lending, marketing, who are great at what they do. Then they get into a room, and a lot of the times they're walking in with everything buttoned up, and they're going to be talking about financial stats and things that are totally stats and departmental related things you have no idea about. But you kind of sit there quietly, nod your head and go, oh, you make a comment here or there to seem like you get what everyone's talking about. No one's talking about it. So how do you cut through? The reality is, I had to transition from playing that game where I walk in all buttoned up, act like I'm the bee's knees and I'm talking about the right things, to actually tapping someone on the shoulder after the meeting saying, I have no idea what you were talking about. Can we sit down, and can I understand a little bit more about your function, what you care about? And really, if you think about that, it's being vulnerable enough to do that, reaching out to someone else who you can trust that politically isn't gonna kill you,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
and just making that emotional connection. You know,
It, I suppose the element there is being brave, isn't it? It's being
yeah,
brave enough to put your hand up, or tap somebody on the shoulder and say, do you know, I don't know. And I feel,
yeah,
how do we create an environment for leaders in a boardroom where that's safe to do so? We were doing a session this week, Kyall, with members here in London, all about psychological safety, and of course we talk about, yes, that people can speak up and share their mind and share their vision of what should change or how things should be different. But actually turning that into an environment that actually listens and does those things is two different things. And I'd love to get your view on how you've managed to perhaps go from asking the question to then maybe also encouraging others to do the same thing. Has that happened, or is that something a work in progress maybe, or have you seen that happening through taking the lead?
I think it's always going to be a work in progress, right? Like you very rarely will find a situation where you walk into a room and it's all about sharing and things actually get done. Because at one end of the spectrum, you can sit there and talk about your feelings and share and all that kind of stuff, and nothing gets done. And then on the other end of the spectrum, it's just, let's just do this. I'm not listening to anyone. So how do you kind of navigate the in-betweens of those spectrums? At least, within my teams and how I approach things, there's something I learned. I mentioned that part of my journey was therapy and executive training. Um, how you facilitate an environment within your teams that allows people to feel safe to share their emotions. There's something I did, and I do this on a daily basis with our teams. When we have our daily stand-up meetings, everyone starts by talking about how they feel, actually. And for the first 6 or 7 months, we kind of had, because we're on doing this on a Zoom, I splashed up what's called an emotions wheel, because sometimes people struggle to say how they actually feel, and you normally default to, I feel good,
Yeah, I'm good, thanks.
but that's not what you want.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you've got an emotions wheel in front of you and go, okay, content, anxious, prideful, that by getting people to name their emotions, firstly started them on the journey of being aware that when you walk into work, you're a human being and you have emotions, and it's okay to have good ones, bad ones, and all that kind of stuff. So getting people to feel safe about that, it was transformational in the team, because it started with people would just say, yeah, okay, I feel good, I feel happy, and just the safe kind of responses. But I had to lead with, you know what, I feel anxious today. I've got a couple of really big meetings and I'm running out of time and I feel anxious. After I led from the front with that vulnerability, I noticed other people starting to do the same thing. And the reason why I bring that up is that's kind of a stepping stone for building a muscle, like going to the gym within the teams to feel safe to be honest, and that happens over a long period of time. The other thing that's quite interesting, and I read this somewhere, I wish I remember, but it's quite a simple and basic thing to do as a leader. If you ask more questions than actually speak, and if you end your questions with, how can I support you? And you militantly do that, the first things you're talking about is, okay, are we aligned? Prove to me that you're aligned. And then you finish with, it's great that we're aligned. How can I support you? And the more and more you do that, the more you're going to realize that people suddenly, A, feel like they're being supported, feel like they're being heard, and you suddenly have a roadmap as to what to do to keep your staff members feeling heard and happy and supported ultimately. And that's also kind of what I learned as a leader as well, because you're basically playing a supporting role. You know, you're no longer kind of leading from the front and running. You're supporting, you're managing, you're inspiring, all that kind of stuff.
That's interesting, Carl, because it kind of goes hand in hand also with your realization of how to manage your furnace, because you're not able to allow your furnace of drive and ambition to overtake yourself in those conversations, because you've got to give people the space with which to have their vulnerability. So I love how you've really considered those areas, which is, it's inspiring to hear. If I kind of think about that, almost that theme, if you like, of what got you here won't get you there. Now we're stood here today. There's awards on the trophy behind you. There are, your sounds and feels and everything's moving forward from a work perspective, a happiness perspective. I'd love to perhaps then take a look forward and think about, well, what does the future role of a leader look like? Maybe, from Kyall's perspective, because we've got lots of things coming down the pipe right now, which are pretty huge things. If you think about AI, you think about the geopolitical situation that we've got going on across the globe. What should leaders be thinking about right now when they're leading teams, building teams to succeed? What does that look like?
So I think let's talk about some of the fundamentals that are probably going to be the same, and I think more and more as the generations kind of pass on the mantle to some of the younger generations, it's interesting to see how leadership is being redefined. The boomer generation, very much strong, harsh, let's kind of like lead from the front, chest beating kind of alpha type behaviors. And that was a sign of strength, And then as you kind of move down some of the generations to the Gen Xers and the millennials, there's a lot more emphasis on emotional intelligence, and how that significantly improves leadership. And I sit on that fence, I believe that as leaders, emotionally intelligent ones are the ones that are motivating people, inspiring people, being great mentors. And none of that has anything to do with actual production of work, So those kind of things are going to be the same. I believe so throughout, any of the generations and leadership into the future. Now, you mentioned AI, and what is really interesting about AI and what I experience myself is if you subscribe to the thought that being an emotionally intelligent leader is a fantastic way forward for motivating large quantities of people, what are the things that prevent you from being emotionally intelligent? Part of it is either awareness, and you maybe need to do the work to figure that kind of stuff out, read some books, go to therapy, executive training, whatever. And the other part often is time and space, And the thing that's interesting about AI and leadership in the future is I believe if you're using it effectively, unlike any other previous generation, you're going to start realizing you have more time and space to lead, more time and space to read that book that you should be reading, more time and space to do that executive training course, to go to therapy, to go to the gym, to think more holistically about your life, which then creates space for connection and emotional intelligence. So the big question is, how do you leverage this technology to give you back the one thing you want the most? Time. And there's so many different things that we can talk about when it comes to AI and how it's probably going to create that space for you, and you're going to figure out what you're going to do with that space.
It's so pertinent that you say that. I was with members in Toronto last week having a similar conversation about psychological safety and the space and the time to be able to create the culture where people can ask the right questions and feel safe to create the right culture to do that. And one of that is about giving people the time, investment of time to know them and to understand them enough so that they can feel comfortable to do those things. And I've not quite heard or seen the connection between the freeing of time resource to become a better leader in that style. I've not considered it perhaps in that way. Quite often we talk about, oh yes, I can send out more emails, or I can be more personalized, or my chatbot's going to be better. But actually, at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. It's about time, isn't it? It's about time and how we choose then to use that time. And being better leaders perhaps is a no better way of using our time, at least from a work perspective, and for sure. Kyall, one of the sections that we always have in our podcast is a question from our members. And so the question that we have for you is, what's one failure that stands out to you in your journey, and how did it shape the way that you approach challenges in your leadership today?
Ooh, I like this. You put me on the spot,
I
huh?
have, yeah. We can't all be easy.
Yeah. One of the things that really, there was this one implementation where best efforts, we were spending millions on this, and it was kind of broken up into different countries, and different people had accountability of rolling out Salesforce into those different countries. And I had multiple, and one of these countries that I had was a lower priority country. Typically when you're talking about big technology implementation, US, Europe, UK, they get the priority. But one of the countries that I had, I was the guy that was sent there as the Trojan horse, and there to kind of get the system implemented. But I'd go back to the head office, and I knew that they were so low down the pecking order. All of the development resources were going somewhere else. And it was a very difficult situation for me, because I'd always walk in, promise something, knowing that I couldn't deliver it, knowing that headquarters were not going to prioritize what we needed in order to do that. And I went through a very dark period, actually, because I took so much on. I felt so, I just wanted to win. That furnace, I didn't want that to fail. I didn't want to stand in front of the CEO and just continually get lambasted by them. And really, after going through quite a dark phase, that was really the first time in my life, my early 30s, where I was like, okay, can't sleep, not eating well, something's up, something needs to happen. And that never occurred before in my life, because it was just consistent wins. And from that failure, I learned the power of meditation, actually. And that really, in my earlier days, kickstarted, I guess, self-awareness training, and realizing that there's something there. It's not just gurus and, woke people trying to sell you stuff. There's actually something there. And from starting that journey of being aware of your emotions and trying to be a bit more present, that has definitely helped me at an executive level. It's almost like this muscle that's been trained that allows me to be, that half a second between triggering and reaction, that half a second between triggering and words, that space that's created through awareness of emotions, has been critical in an executive type of environment, because most of the time you're triggered. Most of the time someone's throwing something at you, or it's a fire you got to put out, and that's what you paid for. So that was really the thing that came to mind there.
Yeah, thank you, Kyall, and thank you for being so open in terms of sharing. And I think it doesn't happen enough. And I know we really enjoy having you in the Blend community, because sharing stories like that and being open about the reality of being a leader is so important to our members. And it's so important because that's how as you rightly pointed out earlier, we make our muscles sore and we can become stronger by doing so. So thank you, Kyall. That means a lot to us. One of the other things that we ask our guests on the Fall Forward podcast to do is share with us a recommendation, something that you've so you've kind of talked a bit about meditation and self-awareness, but what else would you recommend to leaders watching this podcast as something that's really helped you and perhaps could help them along their journey as they become that leader of tomorrow that we just talked about?
Yeah, it was funny during the pandemic when I decided to go on this kind of like inner work journey, and yes, therapy and executive training. What really flicked the switch for me, and this totally comes from me being a Vietnamese boat refugee, growing up poor and all that kind of stuff. You're pretty successful as an executive. You got a decent amount of money, and I thought to myself, what would happen if I spent 10% of my net income on my physical and mental health and just militantly did that, you know? And then that opened up, okay, let's try meditation class. Let's try this, and just spend the money, you know? And I was thinking to myself, I spend 10% of my net income on garbage. So spending that on myself and investing in yourself physically and mentally was transformational, and it helped me build the muscles I needed to just change from old Kyall to new Kyall. I've got this running joke between my friends. There's Kyall 1.0 pre-pandemic and then Kyall 2.0 who approaches things totally differently, and they all see it. They all see the vulnerability, the happiness. It's yeah, that's what I would suggest to your members. Just spend the money. Don't be a tight ass on yourself like I was. Just see what happens. Do it for a year, and you'll be like, oh, this makes a lot of sense.
I'm going to accept that challenge, Kyall, actually. I'm going to take that challenge on
Love it.
because I think you're absolutely right. We don't think about it in that way. We're happy to invest, a proportion of our earnings into the S&P 500 every month, but why shouldn't we be investing in ourselves? It's more important. I don't do it, and I'm going to take on your challenge. So thanks, Kyall. Thanks, mate, for that. Kyall, that brings us to time. Thank you so much for being with us today on the Fall Forward podcast. We love having you, as I said, as a Blend member, and it's been lovely to have you here sharing some of your leadership journeys and lessons with us today. So really appreciate having you. And we hope to see you. Well, we will see you in the not too distant future in New York and beyond. So thanks, Kyall. You've been a legend, and we'll speak to you very soon.
I appreciate you, and I love Blend. Keep going, guys. You're on the right track. So really appreciate everything you guys do. Thank you.
Thanks, mate. We'll speak to you soon. Make sure you subscribe to the Fall Forward channel so you don't miss any new episodes. I'll see you soon.